Studies, as well as the Immigration History Research Center archives and the University of Minnesota Libraries. So a lot of people came together today to make this happen, and I think it's really appropriate because this story shows these very networks that come into play in telling these stories. And there's many different sides to this story, but when you bring them all together, you really see that narratives like the Smyrna atrocity kind of affect many different people in many different ways. I also want to give a note that there's an additional upcoming event. This is the 21st annual James Cunningham Memorial Lecture on Eastern Orthodox History and Culture, and this is going to be about the symbols and power and fragility of monuments in medieval Armenian architecture. And this will be this upcoming Friday, the 6th of November, and there is an RSVP for that, and you can find that through the variety of the networks that I'm sure many of you are already a part of, but just a reminder to look for that. I'm going to just give a couple brief comments, and I'm going to pass it off to the U of M political science professor, Catherine Goosen, and followed by the key person we've come here today is Boston University professor of journalism, Lou Ureneck, to share from his book on the Great Fire, one American's mission to rescue victims of the 20th century's first genocide. And then there'll be some time for some Q&A and then book signing following. But first I'd like to set a little stage for the archival perspective here. There are many things that I love about my job and profession, but probably the thing I enjoy the most is, as an archivist, we're aware of all of these hidden stories in our collections. All of these narratives, these threads, these lives that we document that many people don't know about. And for years, the story of Asa Jennings has been one of those. And I regularly say, I'm just waiting for someone to come, someone who recognizes this story, someone who knows this, because I couldn't believe it, why this wasn't more widely known. And I remember a few years ago, Lou gave me a call and said that he was working on a book on Asa Jennings, and my heart just leapt because as he described where he was at, he had done his research, he knew where he was at. I knew that the story of Asa Jennings was in very good hands. Frequently what I tell students when they come here to do research for the first time is that an archive contains the raw material of research. We've got bits and scraps of narrative, and it's up to you as a scholar to bring your tools and your knowledge to bear, to pull together those threads and tell the story as you see it to be true. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not, and I think for those of you who haven't read the book yet, but will hopefully buy a copy today, you'll see that this story has been handled with great care and great love and great understanding. So I'm going to save as much time for the other people, so please allow me to bring up now Professor Catherine Goosen.
Well, it's an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce our distinguished guest, Lou Ureneck, and to speak under the auspices of centers with which I have at times collaborated and learned much from, especially the Center for the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center and the Modern Greek Studies Center. I would like to share with you very briefly a few things I have learned from this book. But first, please allow me to bring in a personal note. This book is in part about the story of an all too forgotten event in the Near East, the Great Fire which destroyed the Greek and Armenian parts of Smyrna. This story is particularly meaningful for me as I am the daughter of a Greek Ottoman woman who was born in Constantinople in 1916. I grew up hearing about 1453, the year the Ottoman Sultan entered in Hagia Sophia, the Orthodox Church in Constantinople, on his throne, as if it were yesterday. One of my favorite great aunts was Fia Maria, a tall and dignified lady with a little moustache and a strong sense of humor, who had been a wealthy young widow and the owner of many buildings in Smyrna. Fia Maria lost it all in the Smyrna fire, although she was residing in Switzerland at the time. She raised alone her 3 children under very modest conditions, thanks to the help of her brothers, one of whom was my grandfather. Ureneck describes graphically the merciless wars Turkish nationalist soldiers under the leadership of General Mustafa Kemal fought against the Greek troops, who had come to free Asia Minor from 450 years of Ottoman rule. As Ureneck writes, on both sides the urge to war was fanned by nostalgia for old empires, Byzantine and Ottoman, and for what each side thought was rightfully its own. No matter what, I was not raised to hate the Turks. My grandparents left with their children, the first in 1922, the others in 1924. There was nostalgia. There was some sense of superiority. Indeed, as if the Greeks had invented civilization, as Ureneck writes. On the other hand, the fact that my grandfather had studied in Turkish at the prestigious Ottoman high school Galatasaray Lisesi, which is still a Turkish elite public institution today, was a cause for great pride in my family. And so I wonder, and that's my first question, do memories of the tragic events so well described, so tragically described in this book, help or hamper when individuals and states try to move on and build the future, not necessarily together, but at least not against each other? There have been some unexpected rapprochement, at least to this person, between Greeks and Turks in the last 2 decades, albeit with ups and downs. This is, of course, a question I leave pending. For better or for worse, memories connect. And this brings me to my second point. Indeed, there is another, in some ways, more central argument in Ureneck's book than the fire of Smyrna, however prominently this features. This book gives us the example of different kind of US involvement abroad. And in spite of my thick foreign accent, I'm a US citizen. I teach US citizens. And so this is a question which concerns me a lot. We know of US presence abroad through business, media, science, the military. But this book describes an unusual partnership between what we would call today civil society, educators, missionaries, philanthropists, and American, British, and Greek Navy officers. Few of us who go to the gym today at the YMCA know of its cosmopolitan tradition. I came to this country some 40 years ago to work with an NGO which had been founded by an American minister who had cut his teeth with the YMCA in China. And so Ureneck very usefully reminds us of another tradition of US involvement abroad, a low-key, informed and effective involvement to create the new. This book also shows us a different kind of US tradition in the US Foreign Service, where instead of being rotated every 2 or 3 years, diplomats stayed in place sometimes for decades and sometimes for the worst. But in the case of George Horton, the US consul in Smyrna, for the better. He spoke 4 languages beside his own, and he knew everybody, and everybody knew him there. The 2 unexpected heroes of this book are Methodist New York Minister Asa Jennings, who comes to Smyrna just before the fire to broaden the programs of the YMCA, to train young men. And then there is Lieutenant Commander Halsey Powell, a Navy commander. And those 2 are going to team up to go around the instruction of a rather obdurate US High Commissioner in Istanbul, Mark Bristol. So we should remember also this kind of involvement. And this is another contribution this book makes to my education, and I think to the education of any readers. The most extraordinary things about Asa Jennings is that after the Greek-Turkish War, he chooses to return to Turkey to found the American Friends of Turkey, which developed daycare institutions and libraries and other institutions in Turkey. And his son becomes a legal advisor to the Turkish government, and Jennings befriends Bristol, the US ambassador, and even meets President Kemal Atatürk several times. And I wonder, how does Jennings deal with his memories of the atrocities he witnessed on a daily basis for 5 or 6 weeks in Smyrna. How could he forget if he did what he witnessed? There is there a mystery, and I hope one day to read something by Lou on this. Who knows? Finally, this book combines the examination of large-scale political phenomena with individual initiative. And this is rare in the social sciences, at least in political science. We are not good at doing this. Our practical daily experience teaches us that individual initiatives matter. Yet, in the age of globalization, which is in fact nothing new, as this book demonstrates, we often feel dwarfed as individuals. What can we make of the examples of this book, of individual initiatives? Political philosophy, which is one of my area of study, brings some responses to this. European Union studies, which is another of my areas, does not. In any case, this book connects both in a very compelling manner. And perhaps it might inspire some new initiatives on the part of those concerned with the current refugee crisis, which is unfolding tragically in the same part of the world. In conclusion, I would like to encourage you all to get this book, and if you can, to read it, borrow it. Ureneck bridges artfully the gap between journalism and research. The book doesn't have footnote that you can see in the text. However, the end of the book has almost 100 pages of footnote attached to little paragraph of the text. It cites a well-researched bibliography and an index. In other time, it's very readable for those who don't want to know about all the research behind it, and yet it has all the sources. And I turn it over now to our distinguished author. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you for that beautiful and smart introduction. You know, what a teacher. I'm sitting there and I'm beginning to reflect. I'm trying to answer the questions that you're posing here, and I'm challenged. Really, very beautiful. Thank you. I'm flattered to be here. I'm honored to be here. And, you know, all of you on such a beautiful Minneapolis afternoon to take time to listen about this tragic story is flattering and honoring to me. I want to thank the sponsors for this event. Many people came together in order to make this happen, and I appreciate the contributions of all of them. I want to single out Ryan Bean in particular, who has been so very helpful to me over the course of a number of years in doing the research for this book. Initially, I called Ryan and I said, I'm working on this book, and I know there are a few documents at your library, and I'd like to have a look at them, but I don't really want to make the trip to Minneapolis. I was trying to make my advance. I was going to make 5 trips to Turkey and 6 to Greece. I knew I needed to make that advance last. So I asked Ryan if he would PDF scan and send me some of the documents, and he did that several times. And finally he said to me, you know, you really need to get out here. And I'm awfully glad that I did. I spent several days at the archives, tremendous amount of assistance from Ryan and his staff, and it proved to be crucial to the book in ways that I would never have anticipated. There were surprises in the documents that changed the narrative, deepened my understanding of the people in the book, and it would have been a far less interesting and less revealing book had I not had Ryan's help. So thank you very much. You know, just one more thing I want to say before I tell you the story of Smyrna, and that is that I've been speaking around the country about this book, and I frequently speak to audiences where there are people in the audience who have family connections back to Smyrna. You know, we are only 2-3 generations. In fact, I've had the example of being 1 generation person in the audience removed from Smyrna. And I am honored by those of you who, there are some people here in the audience, I know, who have family connections back to Smyrna and back to Asia Minor, and for whom the memories, the suffering, the death, the way in which life changed for so many families in Asia Minor remains a vital part of your family history and your consciousness. And so I'm really pleased to welcome you here in particular. On September 9, 1922, the Turkish army entered the city of Smyrna, the Turkish Nationalist Army. 600 cavalry, battle-hardened men. They were sunburned, on horseback, their guns across the croppers of their saddles. Some of them had their swords drawn. They were the vanguard of a much larger and victorious army that had just driven the Greek army from Asia Minor. The Greek army having been invited to protect Smyrna by the Americans, President Wilson, and the British 3 years earlier. They fought a grinding war and they lost. Smyrna was the principal target of the Turkish army in terms of winning the war and occupying the city. So on September 9, the cavalry enters, and it's followed by more cavalry, 250,000 other soldiers behind the vanguard, at about 11 o'clock in the morning. It was a beautiful day. It was a hot summer of 1922. Late in the afternoon, the army had lost its discipline. And there was no attempt by the officers of the Turkish Nationalist Army to enforce discipline. By midnight, the army had turned first toward the Armenian section of the city. Smyrna was a city divided into ethnic and religious districts, neighborhoods. The Armenian quarter was at the back of the city. The Turkish army went there first and began looting businesses. Then it began looting homes. And very soon, before the night was out, they were pulling families from their homes and businesses and killing them in the street. Killing men, women, and children. Sword, shooting, stabbing. And rape was general through the Armenian quarter. It was a horrible scene. The slaughter lasted and spread. It spread generally over the city of Smyrna, the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th. Soon, there was no safe place in the city for a Christian to be. They were all vulnerable to an army that was out of control. It was an army that was underpaid. It was hungry. It had been propagandized deeply by its leadership about the dangers presented by the Greeks and the Armenian subjects, Ottoman subjects, fellow subjects of the Ottoman Empire. Making matters worse was this. Ahead of the Turkish army, as the Turkish army had moved from the east westward toward the Aegean rapidly, all of the Christian residents, or most of the Christian residents of the villages and the farms and so forth behind Smyrna, fled to the city of Smyrna to escape the army, the wrath of the Turkish army. By the end of the first week of September, there were at least 300,000 refugees in the city of Smyrna. Smyrna had a population of about 500,000. It was a big city, a big and very busy city. 300,000 more people, poor people, who came in with a little bit of food wrapped in a piece of cloth, maybe a blanket. They brought their farm animals. They didn't know what was ahead for them. Women carrying children under both arms. They took what they could quickly, not unlike some of the refugees that are fleeing the war zone today. A blanket, some food. Many of the women refused to leave their Singer sewing machine behind at home. And there are pictures. You can see these little women carrying these heavy Singer sewing machines into the city of Smyrna. They carried the old men on their backs. These were strong women. They came into the city. They found a little bit of shade. It was a hot, as I say, summer. They put down their blankets and they waited. They thought they would be safe at Smyrna. Why? Well, Smyrna had a long history of good governance, but more importantly, all of the great powers, those powers that had been victorious in World War I, which only had recently, just a few years earlier, concluded, defeating the Ottoman Empire were represented at Smyrna. They were represented as a strong naval force. The British had 2 battleships and numerous destroyers. The French had 2 battleships. The Italians had battleships and cruisers. The Americans initially had 1 destroyer, but before the month was out, we would have 5 destroyers at Smyrna. There was a tremendous amount of Western firepower watching over Smyrna. So these poor people who came into Smyrna thought that they would be protected. It was a very deadly miscalculation. Before I tell you more about what happened to Smyrna, I'm going to bring the camera back a little bit and just to provide a little bit of context on the city and in that period in history. Smyrna was an exceptional city, maybe nothing like it in the world. It was a cosmopolitan city. It was principally a Christian city in the Ottoman Empire. Unusual in and of itself. There were more Greeks in Smyrna than there were in Athens. Athens was a dusty village compared to Smyrna. Majority Christian, but with many faiths represented. It was a tremendously rich city, rich and sophisticated. It was rich by virtue of its trade. It was a city with a genius for business, for trade. The Greeks and the Armenians in particular built enormous trading firms at Smyrna. It was rich by virtue of its tobacco. For better or worse, there would have been no American cigarette industry without the tobacco that passed through Smyrna. Camel cigarettes, the first national consumer brand, Turkish tobacco that passed through Smyrna. Tremendous fortunes were built up both in the United States and at Smyrna as a consequence of the tobacco trade, a little flavorful leaf that made Virginia burley possible to smoke. The carpet trade, 95% of the carpets that came out of all of Asia passed through Smyrna. The Armenians and the Levantines, the Europeans at Smyrna, controlled the carpet trade. Opium was legal, American cough syrup, medications. There was a family called the Onassis who controlled the opium trade. They also traded in tobacco. Socrates Onassis had a very difficult son. He was a playboy, even at age 16. His name was Aristotle. They were important traders, built up a giant fortune in the city of Smyrna. Many other products, the dried fig, a very big product in those years, the Smyrna fig from Smyrna, big fortunes. When the Americans decided they wanted to have a fig industry in California, they sent their agronomist to work with the Greek farmers to figure out how do you grow a fig. It turned out to be not so simple. Again, great fortunes. So there was a tremendous amount of money at Smyrna, and there was a making of money and there was a spending of money. It was a very happy place. The city of Smyrna is built on it's a port city. It has a harbor front, a so-called quay, which is a kind of promenade, cobblestone promenade in those days that lines the bay. And along this promenade were grand hotels, mansions built from beautiful Turkish marble that glimmered. They looked like sugar cubes as you approached the city. Performance spaces for the symphony, for the opera, Greek musical theater, private clubs, fancy restaurants. If it could be bought, it could be had in Smyrna. There were yacht clubs. The first golf course in the Near East was at Smyrna. A race course. Everybody was having a good time at Smyrna. So that made it a little bit different than the rest of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, those Muslim Turks who didn't live at Smyrna referred to Smyrna as Gevauer Izmir, infidel Smyrna. The dresses were short, the music was loud, the women wore makeup. It was quite the place in the 1920s and earlier, the Belle Epoque. So all of this distinguished Smyrna, but what really made Smyrna different was that it was a place where people of different religions and ethnicities lived together in harmony. It was a cosmopolitan city. Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Turks, and Levantines. Levantines being the European settlers of the 17th and 18th centuries who came there, built businesses, didn't have to pay taxes because of diplomatic concessions, and had homes on the style of what we see in Newport, Rhode Island. If any of you have been to Newport, you've seen the breakers and so forth. This is how the Levantines lived at Smyrna. They had staffs so large in their mansions that the servants would fill villages. They would populate villages. Incredible place. But it was the religious tolerance, maybe because everybody was making money and having fun, I'm not sure, but it was a place where people lived together and coexisted together. They ate each other's food, they spoke each other's languages, they visited each other's homes, and they did business with each other. You know, the Smyrnians love to tell a story. It might begin in French and then move into Greek, and then the punchline might be in Turkish. You know, this was Smyrna. What a place. So it's this city that the Turkish army entered on the 9th and turned toward massacre, making it especially poignant what would happen. So a massacre is underway, and the refugees who are there are hiding. They're mostly gathering on the quay, but they're in churchyards and railroad stations, on the streets and so forth. Suffering, dying. Then to make matters worse, when it seems impossible, well, I want to add one more important bit of context before I move to the next step of the Smyrna story, and it's this. And it's important. And it relates to the Morgenthau quotation. Many of you have heard of the Armenian Genocide. It's a historical fact. It's an event that's been well documented. There are photographs and testimonies and scholarship. There's no question that this genocide occurred. But it occurred within the context of a 10-year, what I call religious cleansing of Asia Minor, of Anatolia. The Armenians rightfully and proudly and importantly mark their genocide. This is the 100th anniversary this year. The Pontic Greeks speak of their genocide. The Ionian Greeks speak of their catastrophe. The Assyrians speak of their genocide. But really, if you get enough altitude, so to speak, on this situation, you can see what was happening was an attack on Christianity in Asia Minor, beginning in about 1912. That's when I date it. That's my personal date, soon after the Balkan Wars. And what happened at Smyrna really is the culmination, in my view, of 10 years of religious, we can call it genocide, we can call it slaughter, we can put a number of different labels on it. 3 million people, by many accounts, Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians, died during that period. And Smyrna would bring that to an end. And the place in which Christianity first took root, where St. Paul walked, Ephesus, Philadelphia, Smyrna, churches named in Revelation, Christianity would be extirpated. There are essentially no Christians in that part of the world anymore. It was a successful extirpation of Christianity from Asia Minor. On September 13, back to Smyrna, 1922, the Turkish army set 4 fires around the Armenian neighborhood. Typically, a north wind blows over that part of the Mediterranean, the Meltemi. It cools the hot cities, Salonika, Smyrna. But on that particular morning, a south wind came up off the Syrian desert. Unusual. It was unsettling to people. And shortly after that wind came up, these fires were lit. We don't know why they were lit, but we have some theories about that, and we can talk later. But we know for sure that they were lit by the Turkish army because we have American and British witnesses, missionaries, business people, American naval officers. The fires soon converged and rapidly spread. They very rapidly destroyed the Armenian quarter, which was at the back of the city, and then quickly spread generally throughout the city, the Greek section, the European section. The Turkish section and the small Jewish section was on the other side of the fire line, north. So as a consequence, this wind didn't push the fire in that direction. So these people who had locked themselves in their homes, bolted their doors against the Turkish army, were flushed out of their homes and made vulnerable. The refugees left the churchyards and even the graves where they were hiding, so the tombs and the railroad stations. And this analogy is a little rough, but I think it might help you picture what happened at Smyrna. Maybe some of you have seen these nature films where there's a big forest fire and the animals are trying to outrun the flames of the forest fire, and the flames are moving forward, and you see the deer and the other animals kind of running just steps ahead of the fire. This is what happened at Smyrna. Hundreds of thousands of people trying to outrun a very fast, hot fire. They went as far as the harbor front. They couldn't go any further. An entire city, almost, of people captured on this quay. Maybe it's 60 or 70 feet wide, almost 2 miles long, packed together so tightly that some of them began to asphyxiate. By midnight, the fire breached the hotels and the cinemas and the private clubs and so forth. The fire was so hot that the ships, the American ships, the British ships in the harbor, had to drop back because their canvas tarpaulins and the hemp hawser lines were igniting from the heat. Imagine what it was like to be a person on the quay in the shadow of that fire. Women were wetting their blankets and wrapping their children so that they wouldn't incinerate. People were committing suicide. They were so traumatized by what they were witnessing. They were jumping into the water trying to swim to the Western ships, which were reluctant, at best, to pick them up. Some of them got caught in the propellers of the big ships. The women were wearing heavy dresses. They had children. They drowned. The harbor was soon bobbing. It was a scene right out of hell. The animals that they had brought with them had packs on their backs. These packs caught fire and the animals were stampeding. It was really just horrible. About 1 o'clock in the morning, the Turkish army began to pour kerosene on the streets that went down to the quay. And the British admiral, chief of the entire Mediterranean fleet, who was this close to war with Turkey and really preparing to fight a war, was overcome by the suffering of the people on the barges that were lit. We have someone here in the audience who had a family member on one of those barges. And he put many British boats overboard, and they tried to take some people off the quay, maybe 2,000 out of hundreds of thousands from the worst part of the quay. It was a drop in the bucket. The fire burned for 3.5 days, and when it was done, there was very little water in the city. The pipes had melted. There was very little food, and that went to the army. And you can just imagine what the sanitary conditions were like there in the city. The bathrooms, all of these people, the animals, and so forth. Very quickly, disease broke out. And people were dying by the scores, the hundreds, and the thousands. Now, incredibly, the world was focused on Smyrna. It was the lead story in dare say, every newspaper in America. The New York Times, in Oklahoma, in Massachusetts, in Minnesota, Kansas. The American public was focused on what was happening to the Christian population of Asia Minor, and Smyrna in particular. But there was no help forthcoming. The governments essentially were paralyzed, and maybe that's a euphemism. Each of the governments, the United States, France, Britain, Italy, who were represented, were making a kind of personal, let's say, or narrow national strategic decision about not getting involved. So the world was focused, and American public opinion was highly charged, but nobody was doing anything, with the exception of about 24 private Americans who lived in the city of Smyrna. They formed the American Relief Committee, and they had formed it in the beginning of the month when the refugees first started coming in, under the auspices of George Horton, the consul general. They tried to feed people, they tried to do what they could, but of course there were too few of them, and there was really very little they could do to allay this tremendous amount of suffering. One of the members of that relief committee was a man named Asa Jennings, who Catherine has described. Very unusual guy. First, he was a funny-looking little guy. He was not quite 5 feet tall. In his 20s, he had had tuberculosis, then he got something called Pott's disease, and his spine collapsed. He lost 5 inches of height. He spent a year in a body cast. He would not have survived that ordeal had it not been for his wife, Amy. And if I had more time, I would tell you about their very interesting marriage. Built around faith and dedication to each other. She saved his life. She really dedicated a number of years of his life to saving Asa's life. He came out of that a broken man, in the sense that he was crooked, and he had a hump on his back. And he always wore a jacket that was too big so you couldn't quite see the hump. He wore a straw boater and a big pair of glasses that magnified his eyes. So he had big eyes and a big head that seemed too big for this body. And he was always looking up and smiling at people above him. He was a cheerful guy, a little motor of a man. He loved to sing, he loved to talk, he was sociable. When he had worked with the soldiers in France, that was a previous assignment before he had arrived, he was a big favorite with the soldiers because he was kind of a cut-up, and liked to tell a clean joke. He was a Methodist minister. Jennings was not taken seriously by the others on the American Relief Committee, and this is one of the breakthroughs that I learned here at the archives. The YMCA leader at the time was a young, dynamic guy who was doing great work at Smyrna, really. He was trying to save the YMCA chapter at Smyrna. But he wanted a big, handsome American who could help him raise money as the new employee at the YMCA. And instead he got this funny-looking little guy, pious Methodist minister, and the two of them never really connected. And Ernest Jacob, who otherwise did good work, pushed Jennings aside on the American Relief Committee, but Jennings decided, as I say, he was a man of great energy. He had a fever every day of his life as a consequence of the tuberculosis. He had a pain in his thorax every day of his life, and he coughed as a result of all of these diseases. He decided to make himself useful on his own, and the first thing he did, quite amazingly, was he occupied a series of these vacated mansions on the Smyrna waterfront. The rich Greeks and Armenians who had occupied them had the wherewithal to get out of there before the Turkish army had arrived. Jennings took these homes and he turned them into safe houses for women who had been raped. You have to remember what was happening at Smyrna at that time was sort of like a medieval army sacking a city. Looting and sacking, pillaging and raping. So rape was a very major weapon of war. And Jennings went around the city with his limp and his straw boater, collecting women and bringing them to these safe houses. They followed him. They brought their children. Then he got an old Chevrolet that he drove around the city, and he was picking up, more women and bringing them there. And soon he had 3 houses and several thousand women safe in his safe houses. But again, it wasn't enough. People were dying, and the world was not taking any action. So what could be done? It seemed like nothing could be done. The Turkish army had begun to march people out of the city. At first, the men. And it was a deportation. It was a kind of repeat of what had happened to the Armenians in the 1915 and 1916 period, when their villages had been emptied and the men were killed outside of the villages and the women were taken on long marches until they died of exhaustion or disease. It looked like everybody was going to die. On September 20, it happened to be Jennings' 45th birthday, coincidentally, he stepped out of one of the safe houses and he looks out on the harbor and he sees an Italian freighter. And he thinks, maybe I can get some people on that freighter. And by this time, the American leadership, the senior naval officer at Smyrna, changed. Arthur Hepburn left, and Lieutenant Commander Halsey Powell had arrived. Jennings went to Powell and said, I need a sailor and a boat to get out to that vessel to see if I can get some people aboard. Now, as Catherine mentioned, we had an individual as our High Commissioner, a kind of ambassador at Constantinople, as it was called at the time, who, and I will use this word advisedly, was despicable. He held two portfolios. He was an admiral and he was the State Department's representative in that part of the world. There were three things in this world that that Bristol didn't like, basically in this order: Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. He said, you put them in a bag and shake it up, pour it out, you can't tell one from the other. They're commercial races. They're not capable of governing themselves. He saw them as a kind of lower form of life. When trouble broke out at Smyrna, he had the resources to respond, but he did not. He did as little as he possibly could. He had to do something, but he did as little as he could, and he made sure that he ferried the Standard Oil executives around the Mediterranean before he got to Smyrna. Halsey Powell, like all of the commanders who worked for Bristol, was told, you're there to protect American tobacco warehouses, Standard Oil, kerosene tanks, American property. You're not there to protect Ottoman subjects, Greeks and Armenians. Stay out of it. We're neutral. So Halsey Powell had gotten that order. But he said to Jennings, okay, I'll give you the boat and the sailor. Jennings went out and paid a pretty good bribe to that Italian ship captain. Near East funds, God bless Near East relief in those years. And over the next day and a half, Halsey Powell loaded 2,000 women, children, and old men onto the Constantinople. That was the name of the vessel. It departed for Lesbos, which is a Greek island, very close to the Turkish shore, maybe 10 miles offshore. It's maybe a 12 or a 16-hour steam in a slow boat from Smyrna. Jennings got to Lesbos, Mytilene, the harbor, middle of the night, put the people ashore, and while he's there, he sees all of these empty Greek merchant ships that had been used to evacuate the Greek army. And he thinks to himself, sort of unreasonably, I wonder if I could get these ships, right? Turkey and Greece are still at war. And he thinks, if I could get them, I wonder if I could get them into Smyrna harbor under the noses of the Turkish troops. And even more miraculously, he thinks to himself, if I could load people onto these ships, I could save a lot of lives, right? This is preposterous. Preposterous. And we have Bristol in Constantinople sort of carefully just playing out the foodstuffs, right? So what happens? Well, I won't tell you all of the detail. I'll let you buy the book. But I will tell you this. Jennings did what a good Methodist minister does when he's faced with the loss of all of this life. He told a few white lies. He vastly overstated his portfolio, his authority. he promised the Greek government that Mark Bristol would protect their ships. Bristol learned about this through the New York Times. He had smoke coming out of his ears. And with the help of a battleship commander, a Greek battleship commander, who in some ways is a little bit like Halsey Powell, his own man, a capable and ethical individual in the military, Yanis Theophanides, they extorted a foreign government. 50 ships. The Greek government gave Jennings, they made him a kind of admiral himself. They gave him 50 ships. While this was happening, he was communicating on the bridge of the Kilkis, Theophanides' battleship, with Halsey Powell back at Smyrna, who unusually, and this is one of these things that's hard to explain. I can only attribute it to Powell's charisma and competence. He did a number of things with the Turks that showed he was a determined American who needed to be dealt with respectfully. And he got permission to bring in unflagged vessels. So picture this, if you will. On September 24, a line of Greek unflagged vessels comes towards Smyrna. Halsey Powell sends out an American destroyer flying the Stars and Stripes, and they come in to Smyrna Harbor. All of these people are along the quay. They've been pushed by the fire. They're all there just waiting to die or to be rescued, right? And Jennings didn't leave a lot of documents. He left a few key letters that are important to the story. But in one of the letters, he describes what it was like to come into Smyrna Harbor on the bridge of the lead ship. And I'm going to read you just 2 sentences from that letter, because I think it shows what a stirring moment this moment must have been for those who were present, both those participating in the rescue and those about to be rescued. The ships proceeded in a line into the harbor. The Lawrence, that was the American destroyer, led the way, flying the flag, and then Jennings. From quite a way out, I could see from my station on the bridge the smoking ruins of what had been the business part of the town. It was the most desolate, fearsome sight I ever saw. And at the water's edge, stretching for miles, was what looked like a lifeless black border. As Jennings' ship drew closer, he saw that the black border was actually the crowd of black-clad women along the quay. As he said, quote, suffering, waiting, hoping, praying, as they had been for ships, ships, ships. As we approached and the shore spread out before us, it seemed as if every face on that quay was turned toward us and every arm outstretched to bring us in. I thought the whole shore was moving out to grasp us. The refugees knew immediately that help had arrived, that they might survive, and a great cheer went up from the crowd, tearful and exultant. When I was in high school and I took a history class, I was taught to remember the Alamo. Somebody should have taught me to remember Smyrna. What an important moment in American history, right? It's not an American story, but we played an important part in what happened there by virtue of the courage of Powell and Jennings. The ships were brought to the railroad pier and people were loaded, and even as they were being loaded onto the ship, they were being beaten and robbed. Powell tried to stop it. He did the best he could. It was very difficult to control the American sailors, the young boys, young men from all over the country in their swabby outfits. They didn't like what they saw, and the officers had trouble controlling them. They were going out there and stopping the Turkish soldiers and taking the girls away from these soldier rapists and so forth. But a miracle happened in 7 days. That was the Turkish deadline. You have 7 days to get everybody out of here, or we're going to march them all into the interior. Death. They got them out. 250,000 people in 7 days. By the end of September, Smyrna was essentially empty of Christians. Smyrna was the worst example of what was happening in Asia Minor at that point, but really this scene was repeated all along the Mediterranean coast, the Sea of Marmara, and the Black Sea. People, Christians leaving the interior, looking to be rescued. The League of Nations couldn't get its act together yet. The American government still, it was helping some who had American citizenship, but generally no. It was Jennings, again, without a portfolio. Everybody in that part of the world thought he worked for the U.S. government. He didn't. Without portfolio, he was chartering ships and raising money and putting crews together and he was on the first ship that went into the Black Sea. This little guy with the hat, and the glasses and the singing and so on. The patriarch of the Greek Orthodox faith in Constantinople, by the middle of 1923, credited Jennings with saving the lives of 1 million people. Think of the number of people who are alive today, Greeks, Armenians, and others, as a consequence of Jennings's actions. So it's a story that I feel privileged to tell. I think it's a story that Americans should know about. And I have just a few slides that I'll show you rapidly. Then I'd be very happy to take your questions and hear your comments. Often people can bring family stories that add immensely. This is the Turkish army, the infantry actually, behind the cavalry, entering the city on September 9. Just to sort of orient you, Izmir, which is the Turkish name for the city of Smyrna, is on the same latitude as Athens. This Aegean Basin is a small place. It's like a Great Lake. We think of ancient history, and this is a big place. It's a small place. It's very, very close. Asia Minor, of course, the Turkish peninsula. This is a picture of the Smyrna waterfront. These are the kinds of homes and buildings. This is a postcard showing the sporting club, where there was great feasts and theater and so forth. These are some iconic pictures. I think some of them are collected over on the table from the Armenian genocide. That 1915, 1916 period when, under cover of war, the Ottoman government engaged in the mass killing. Near East relief posters. America's reputation for generosity in the world dates to Near East relief. It's not the Marshall Plan, it's Near East relief. Children on street corners were selling lemonade and flowers. Universities, police departments, factories, labor unions, synagogues, churches, libraries, women's church groups were all raising money for the Armenians and the Greeks in Asia Minor. It was extraordinary. It was kicked off by a Jewish American, Robert Morgenthau, and America's industrial and religious leadership joined in. It's an extraordinary story for another day. Dominated America's headlines. This is a section of the quay after the first night of the fire. You can see people packed together. Warships in the harbor. An Armenian pulled from his home and killed in the Armenian quarter. A quote, really, sort of almost a footnote, really, but in a way it sort of captures the brutality. These are Turkish soldiers. Maynard Barnes was actually sort of a pro-Turkish. He was kind of close to Bristol. He was in Smyrna at the time, and he was watching what was happening on the quay. The beating of the refugee, this was an Armenian man, was brutal beyond belief. We were within 10 feet of the assailants when the last blow was struck, and I do not believe there was a bone unbroken in the body when it was dropped to the edge of the quay and kicked into the sea. Men were frequently tied, bound, and thrown in to drown after they were being beaten. This is the railroad pier. Famously, a quarter of a million people, again, mostly women, children, and old men, passed over this onto Greek ships to get out of the city. The men were gathered into pens. And when the pen was full, they were taken into the city to burn corpses and to clean things up. And then they were marched out of the city on either work details or they were executed. Here's an American sailor trying to get close. You can see this boat is capsized because so many people are trying to get onto it. Panic. A telegraph attributing the fire to the Turks. So here we have the Paris of the Orient, right? Great Smyrna. Looks like Dresden after the fire. You can't even see the streets because of the rubble. Refugees on barges waiting to be unloaded. This is the back of an American sailor that you see here. Men being moved out of the pens and into the city and then to execution. There's the book. Okay, so I began a book about Asa Jennings, and it turned into something much bigger. And I put all of these pictures up here because I just want to show you what a big canvas these events were. That's Mark Bristol with the big head and the white hat. And here's Asa Jennings and Theophanides and others. And I had to make some decisions. You know, when you write a book like this, there are all these competing narratives. There are competing national narratives, and there are competing individual narratives. How do you sort all of that out, right? You're going to write one book, tell one story. Well, you know, I came down to a few key characters at the top: Jennings and Powell, Bristol, Hepburn, Mustafa Kemal, the leader of the Turkish nationalist movement. Brilliant individual, ruthless, a penetrating vision for a new Turkey. And at the end, a completely interesting woman, Dr. Esther Lovejoy, pioneering in public health, leader of the American Women's Hospital Association. She got herself to Smyrna on a tramp freighter, a Russian freighter. It was flagged for the old Tsar's government. It didn't even exist anymore. She came with a doctor's bag and a bag with some cans of sterno so she could heat up some soup. She delivered babies and cared for the women. I don't know what the right medical term is, but in those years they talked about hysteria. The women were so traumatized by the events that they were speechless. And many of them couldn't be loaded onto the ships because they would fight any male that came at them. They were like animals. They were so frightened. Lovejoy interceded. Powell used her tremendously. She wrote a great book, Certain Samaritans. I would commend it to your attention. She talks about Smyrna. And then finally, our hero, Asa Jennings. But I want to conclude with this thought. When you write a book like this and when you read a book like this, you are definitely left with a feeling that the story belongs to the victims. Now, I'm an American, and I wrote an American book for an American audience, an American publisher, so I have an American story forward. But it's a story that belongs to the people who died and suffered. So I felt it crucial to get their stories into the book. To the left is Garibed Hatcharian. He left a very detailed diary of his life at Smyrna, and he lived through these events. He was arrested and ultimately released. He had a big family, 5 children. He was reluctant to leave Smyrna, and he stayed, unfortunately. He got out on a Jennings ship, and I tell his story. And then to the right of Dr. Hatcharian is the daughter, who I was able to find in Piraeus, Greece by knocking on doors, of a girl who was 14 years old at the time of these events. Her name was Theodora Gravu. Theodora had come into Smyrna with her family, extended family. All of them were killed by the Turkish army with the exception of her 2 little sisters, 1.5 years and 2.5 years old. Theodora took care of those 2 girls through all of September, through the fire, through the massacre, through the loading. And Theodora was loaded onto a Jennings ship, taken to Salonika, and then to Athens, and she eventually led a life in Piraeus. And this is her daughter, who I was able to find and to interview and to talk about those events. So I tell Theodora's story in the book as well. I'm going to conclude there. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Yes, sir.
Even after all these evidence about the genocide, and about the Armenians. I am Greek. I have heard that there were approximately 1.5 million people. Why Turkey does not want to recognize that it happened? We have the Holocaust, and the Germans recognized that they were guilty. What is why Turkey does not want to recognize? Somebody told me because in this case they have to pay restitution to the survivor. Is this the reason?
Well, I can't answer for the Turks. I don't, I think that there are legal issues in terms of reparations that would need to be settled. But I think it's a matter of national shame. What country, what nation, what people want to admit to a genocide? Now, they ought to, of course. I think any nation has a moral responsibility to own up to its history. We here in the United States, we have had our genocidal issues, in a sense, with the American Indians. Different, of course, but I can't answer your question, but I can tell you that the Turkish government very vehemently has made a national project of denying this genocide. And I traveled to Turkey and I talked to many Turkish people as I did the research and so forth. And my sense is that there is a kind of difference between the view of the Turkish people and the view of the Turkish government. The Turkish government has imposed an ideological history, beginning really in 1923, on Turkey. Among the Turkish people, what I find is sort of confusion and lack of knowledge, curiosity, some defensiveness, but not really the kind of argument that you get, at least with the few people that I talked to from the Turkish government. So I can't answer your question. I can say, as somebody who's looked at the documents and so forth, that it's a distortion of history to deny the genocides that occurred in Asia Minor in those years. The evidence is too overwhelming. Yes, sir.
Thank you for this excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Your photographs and your comments with respect to the evacuation, the Jennings evacuation, was that coordinated somewhat with the Turkish troops? Because you said
Oh, yes, right.
It separated the men from the children.
Right, yeah. There were Turkish guards all over the railroad pier, and there were 3 gates and long lines of people, and every person was searched and robbed. People would put jewelry in the hems of their dresses and so forth. Men would dress as women. Every individual was searched by Turkish guards. So what you had on the railroad pier was the Turkish army and American sailors, maybe 300 of them. And the British, who liked Powell very much, it is another interesting backstory, also volunteered to come ashore. They had to be unarmed. They had very tense relations with the Turks. So there were British sailors ashore as well. And all of these people were gathered on the pier as the people were marched on. So yeah, there was coordination. And so there are a couple of ways to think about this. There was definitely brutality as they were leaving, but they were leaving. On the other hand, if all of those people had to be killed, that's a lot of ammunition, right? And what are you going to do with all of these bodies? So it was a solution as well for the Turks to get the Christians out of Smyrna without having to deport them. If that answers your question. Yes?
You mentioned that the story of Near East relief
Yes.
might be a story for maybe another book, but this is your opportunity perhaps to say more about how Near East relief plays into the story of Smyrna.
Yeah. Near East Relief was a tremendous institution. It was a private effort. And it later had, government sanction and so forth, but it was a private fundraising effort that engaged every aspect of American society, high and low. It was really something. And America's religious leaders, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, all participated in this event. enormous sums of money were raised, and the money was spent on orphanages, food, medical supplies, nursing staffs, doctors, and so forth. On the 7th of September, 2 Near East Relief nurses and a doctor went to Smyrna on an American destroyer, and that was it. That was what was available in Constantinople at the time. But Near East Relief had a representative at Smyrna who was pleading for money. He got money from the Rockefeller Foundation. He was pleading for money back in the U.S. And it really is Near East Relief that paid for so many of the ships that later came along and paid for the food and so forth. It's really a stirring story. Smyrna is only really one small part of what Near East Relief achieved, something we can really be proud of. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. My question is that I had always thought that Ataturk had disapproved of the Armenian genocide, but from what you're saying here, he wanted to finish it.
Right.
That's
Sure.
that's
Well,
what I want.
yeah, okay. That's a big question, but I'll give it a shot. Yeah.
From what you said also to the genocide was aimed at Christians, not at Jews.
Right.
Or other Muslims.
Right. That's right. Mustafa Kemal was a brilliant soldier. And he had a vision for a kind of Western Turkey. But his vision of what that meant was a strange aggregation of many different philosophies, and ultimately he was a tyrant. He was a general. He was effective on the battlefield. The genocides that occurred really occurred under 2 governments, the Ottoman government and then under the nationalist government. Now, Kemal was the leader, obviously, of the nationalist government, but my personal take on the material is this. Kemal was less interested in killing Christians than he was in winning battles. He had people around him who he had brought out of the Ottoman government, the Young Turk movement, the Committee of Union and Progress, and so forth, who definitely had those goals. Kemal put in charge of Smyrna the cruelest of all Turkish generals, Nureddin Pasha. Even by Turkish soldier standards, he was cruel. So Kemal was willing to tolerate all of this death of civilians and so forth, but he himself was not lifting a finger, as far as I can see, to promulgate it. He used the people effectively who did, and he didn't try to stop it. And he was perfectly fine with Smyrna burning. He was focused on a new Turkey, and there was going to be a lot of death, and that was fine with him. So that's my take on Kemal. Others may see it differently, and I'm not the world's expert on Kemal, but my sense is that he had other priorities, but he was certainly willing to tolerate all of this killing of civilians. The Greeks and the Armenians were perceived as a threat, when the Ottoman Empire began its decline, which was a long decline. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was in disarray. It was corrupt. It was disorganized. It was falling apart. It was losing territory in Europe and in the Mediterranean. And the elite of the Ottoman Empire was seized by a paranoia about what would happen. And part of its response was anxiety about Christians inside the empire. And not unlike what happened in the 1930s in Germany in some way, the Ottoman elite focused on the Christian population as a kind of scapegoat. There's our problem. They're not loyal. We need to have a homogeneous Turkey for the Turks. And the marker of being a Turk was being a Muslim. So that's why I think the Christians were singled out. The Jews in Smyrna, it was a poor section of the city. They were not perceived to be now it was different in Palestine. you know, the Ottomans were not so happy with the Zionist movement in that part of the empire, but they were not perceived as any kind of territorial or internal threat in Asia, you know, on the Turkish peninsula. And as a consequence, they were not treated in the same way as Christians in Smyrna. I think that that's the difference. Yes?
You know,
There's an expert here who can really answer.
Well, no. It is a matter of record that I wrote to the prime organizers of this, and I told them that this is going to be a great event, you know, coming here and talking about this book. And I have to say, it lived up to my great expectations, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
I happened to read the book very carefully, and I noticed this is a biography of a city, really, as you yourself said. But toward the end, there were a lot of loose ends of individuals and themes that make one say, I wish he could follow it with another book. Now, I would just...
By the way, when I submitted the book, it was about 40% longer, the editor said.
But, yeah. but I was
You're right.
but I was thinking, suppose you had a seminar and you had a group of graduate students and you wanted to encourage them to, what kind of spin-off topics would you suggest might make good research topics for young scholars, young writers, young journalists, and what have you?
Well, that's a great question. You know, there's some. You know, I felt that I was unable. You know, I began my career as a journalist and as a reporter, and I felt that I couldn't do enough reporting on the Turkish narrative. And I wished I had been able. You know, and I worked very hard at this. I wish I had been able to find the Theodora or the Hatcharian on the Turkish side, who was buffeted by you know, sort of, these are my neighbors, but at the same time I feel threatened by them. You know, if I could have found that Turkish narrative that displayed the inner conflict of individuals as a community comes apart and turns murderous toward its neighbors, I wish I could have done that and I didn't. So I would suggest, you know, getting to some of that. I think Kamal is worthy of much more study. We talked about this a little bit over lunch. I don't understand the Greek nation's response to what happened in Asia Minor. It is complicated. It's a little bit like the Greeks are ashamed of what happened or something, but it's not fully addressed in Greek scholarship. Greece has not fully come in a serious way to terms with what happened in Asia Minor. And it has shaped the history of Greece, of modern Greece. The Greeks who came from Asia Minor were different than the Greeks. In many ways, they were more sophisticated. And had a bigger worldview. You know, Greece was a poor, kind of backward place. And, you know, the people from Smyrna came and they ended up being poor and pariahs and so forth. So there's a lot more to be learned about what happened to Greece. So I guess those are some of the things that, and I'm sure there are many more that I'm forgetting right now. You know, how did Bristol manage to play this game for so long? You know, I'd like to know more about him and Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was his protector in Washington. Allen Dulles, you'll know, went on to become the leader of the CIA, and he overthrew the Iranian government. You know, so he's another, you know, American that we are skeptical about. And so I would like to know more about that relationship, and I certainly would like to understand the roots of Bristol's racism. I don't get it. Bristol, he grew up on a farm in Glassboro, New Jersey. The guys around him, his junior officers, were from the South. Some of them from slave-holding families and so forth. I can understand their points of view. You know, I mean, I don't accept it, but I can understand where it can. But I don't understand Bristol. So I think Bristol bears more study as well.
I was
Yes.
just going to ask a more personal question, and you talked about it just briefly, but how did you come to this story? And you said you wished you could report more about Turkey, but how did you
Yeah.
even come to Turkey? What
Right,
what
yeah.
brought you there?
Well, it's interesting. No personal connection. I read a book by an Armenian woman named Marjorie Housepian years ago. It was published in the 1960s, and I read it much later. And Asa Jennings makes a cameo in the book. He's in and he's out. And I thought, whoa, wait a second. He saved 250,000 lives in Smyrna. Oh, who is this? What happened? And so I went and, it was really, I carried that idea around for years and finally decided to go after it. Now, Marjorie's book is really, it's a classic, it's a great book. But we've learned a lot since she wrote the book. There's new scholarship and I don't think she got the Halsey Powell story right at all. But it's a great book. But that's where the idea began, and I just sort of carried around this question, who is Asa Jennings, for years, and then I decided to find out.
What's the book called? Housepian's book?
Housepian's book it went through several titles. Smyrna Affair.
Smyrna Affair, Smyrna 1922.
Right, yeah. It was first, I think, published in England, and then the U.S. I think it came out in the U.S. in '71, and she died about 2 years ago, and it was, to my great disappointment, that I never got to meet her. And she was in very bad health when I tried, so it didn't work out. Smart woman. Yes, sir.
My question may be unrelated to the scope of the book, but let me ask it anyway. Do you think Hitler knew some about this too?
Oh, he knew a lot. There's a lot of new scholarship. The Germans were fast. Well, first they were present. Ottoman Turkey had a very strong alliance with Germany. The Berlin-Baghdad. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of interactivity between those two nations. The Nationalist Socialist Party's leaders early on were very interested in what happened in nationalist Turkey. The idea of engineering a population, right, of going from a multicultural to a homogeneous population was completely interesting to the Nationalist Socialist Party in the 1920s. German newspapers were full of information about Turkey, and many of the Nazi leadership were fascinated by Kemal. Think about what happened. After World War I, Germany was forced to accept the treaty at Versailles, right? There was an occupation by France, and okay. The Allies tried to do the same thing with Turkey, right? A treaty, Severus, and Kemal said, "No way, we're not going to accept that." It's as if a German general in 1919 raised an army in Bavaria and drove the French out and said to the British, "You're not going to dictate the terms of this treaty." Now, one of the big differences, Germany to Turkey, after World War II, we had Nuremberg, right? And people were tried and executed, and so there was a new Third Reich was gone, right? After all of this, this is the same Turkish government. There was no Nuremberg. There was no set of trials. There's no old Turkey. I mean, this is what we have today is a kind of continuation of the government, of the Kemalist government that began. So I think that's part of it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm thinking that when we talk about genocide, we usually think about the Holocaust.
Right.
The Armenian genocide doesn't seem to come up to people's minds. Is that because Turkey is very sensitive about it, and we're very sensitive about our relationship with it?
Right. That's a small part of it. Here's my personal theory. After all of these events, beginning in 1923, the United States had to make a decision. Will we have a relationship with Turkey or not? Commercial and diplomatic relationship. On one side was an awful lot of the public, and the religious leadership of America saying, no, there's too much blood on the hands of the Turkish government, not so fast. On the other side of this question, and it was a big national debate, were the professionals in the State Department who said, America's self-interest is to have a relationship with Turkey. There's oil there, there's money to be made, it's on the southern flank of the Soviet Union. Let's get real about this, okay? So there was a big debate, and the way in which the State Department sort of won the debate was by denigrating the Armenian genocide. It said, look, people talk about a genocide, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, but that's a rough neighborhood. And Greeks kill Armenians, and Armenians kill Turks, and Turks kill them all. What can you do with these people? That was sort of the State Department mentality. And it won the day. And by the end of the 1920s, we had a commercial relationship with Turkey, and seeds of doubt were planted in the public's mind and in the historical record. There was actually a disinformation campaign in America's newspapers and magazines about all of this. And so part of the reason that the Armenians in particular, who have been so well organized around this issue, suffer the insult of having to justify. Imagine if Jews had to justify the Holocaust every time the subject came up, right? It's a legacy of this State Department debate that occurred, in my mind, Alan Dulles, in the 1920s.
Let's thank Lou for coming. If you haven't bought the book yet, please do take the time to do it. Lou will be here for probably another 15 minutes or so, and then he's got a flight to catch to get back teach tomorrow. So he came in very late, and he's leaving very early just to be here with us. So we thank him for that, and thank you again, Lou.
Russia.
Thank you. I did it. Thank you.